1917 October Revolution changed Russia and changed the world. It was the first successful overthrow of a capitalist state and saw working people establish their own state power. It managed to liberate an empire and threaten others. From its very first day, the October Revolution was subject to systematic misrepresentation. Pre-revolution Tsarist Russia was an empire reliant on the external capital of Britain, France and the US. 80% of its people were peasants working on the land, yet most could not support their families. Its organised working class, both male and female, was the youngest in Europe, very militant and open to revolutionary Marxist thought. This was why Lenin described Russia as the weakest link in the chain of imperialism. In February 1917, the Russian Revolution finally broke that chain. As food supplies in Petrograd collapsed, women working in the textile factories demonstrated. The munition workers joined them. In the night, the garrison regiments mutinied, and the following day the capital was in the hands of the people. The result was dual power. The factories and regiments established Soviet councils of workers, with elected representatives and delegates. The military high command forced the Tsar's resignation, and power was handed to a provisional government led by Kerensky and composed of existing ministers. The provisional government had no democratic mandate and continued the war. The Bolsheviks, the majority group in the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, opposed the war alone. The right-wing Menshevik Social Democrats continued to support the war, arguing that a further development of capitalism was required before socialism was possible. In April, Lenin returned from exile to lead the Bolsheviks against this notion. He argued that the crisis had created the basis for a new people's revolution, based on opposition to the war and an alliance between workers and peasants. Britain and France demanded a new Russian offensive to relieve pressure on the Western Front. This demand proved disastrous. Troops mutinied across the front, and Bolshevik organisation and influence intensified.
The Bolsheviks declared that the war was an imperialist war, that the workers were being sent into a bloodbath in the interests of their exploiters, that the leaders of the old International had betrayed the working class, and therefore that the Second International, which had existed since 1889, had collapsed, and that a new international, based on the principles of the class struggle of Marx and Engels, would be essential.
On the 31st of August, the Petrograd Soviet adopted a Bolshevik motion calling for the formation of a Soviet government and the ending of dual power. This idea spread to other Russian cities and across the army. In September, the Soviets of workers, soldiers and sailors now made immediate plans to take power. On a signal from the cruiser Aurora, on the 25th of October, Soviet detachments moved to take over major infrastructures of the country. The ministers of the provisional government were taken into custody and later released. This revolution was almost entirely peaceful. The interim revolutionary government, known as the Congress of Soviets, met on the 27th of October and endorsed Lenin's motion of land to the peasants, the formation of a workers' government and the immediate opening of peace negotiations. This was formulated into a decree adopted by the new government, summed up in the slogan, "Peace, bread and land." Peace negotiations began with German High Command, resulting in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk being signed on the 3rd of March 1918, which surrendered much of Western Russia but ended the war. The counter-revolution began within weeks. The creation of a White Russian army under General Kaledin in the south was supplied with arms and financial aid by Britain. In March 1918, British armed forces landed in the north at Murmansk. British War Minister Winston Churchill said it was his intention to strangle Bolshevism at birth.
Churchill's attitude and the attitude of the British ruling class here was to crush the Russian Revolution. That was the whole attitude that was adopted at that time, and they made no bones about it.
The Soviet government called for the creation of a new Red Army that would incorporate all the loyal elements in the existing regiments with additional recruits from the industrial working class.
The Russians established the Red Army, what was called the Red Army, and it proved to be an effective fighting force. Its morale was something that had never been witnessed before, and as a consequence, of course, the enemies of the revolution met with successive defeats.
Volunteers flooded into the Red Army from the industrial heartlands of Russia, eventually defeating the White Army, the remnants of which were evacuated out of Crimea in 1920. In Britain, a hands-off Russia campaign had emerged to oppose this British intervention in support of the White Army. On the backdrop of industrial unrest, workers in Britain wanted to express international solidarity with their Russian counterparts. In May 1920, dock workers resisted orders by refusing to load the SS Jolly George with arms to be used against the Red Army. It was an effective tactic in the face of imperialist war inspired by the Russian Revolution.
I personally was so proud that I made myself a little hat for a friend of mine and myself, which was like a Cossack's hat, black from back fur fabric, and had a red tassel on it, and we really were proud of the fact that we were supporting her, and we collected food and we made shirts and all that sort of thing for the Russians.
Councils of action were established throughout the country to resist any intervention by the British government against the Soviet Union. The campaign was so general, everyone taking part in it, not limited only to Labour Party members and trade unions, that the government announced it had never been their intention to take military action against the Soviet Union.
The Third International was established after the revolution, hastening the formation of communist parties around the world. Further revolutions in Europe were inspired by the Russian example, such as the German Revolution and the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic. However, these revolutions were ultimately suppressed. As a result of the revolution, Russia began a societal and cultural transformation, with educational and technological advances. This led to its pivotal role later in defeating the Nazis and to the significant realigning of world forces. This is the real legacy of the October Revolution. It also paved the way for the emergence of socialist countries such as Cuba, China and Vietnam. Colonial liberation and pro-independence movements gathered pace across Asia and Africa, often supported by the Soviet Union. Not only Russia, but the world was changed by the events of 1917.